Hello, and today I'm going to talk about switches, what they are, what they do, and how they interconnect to your network. Switches, at their base core, are small devices that look like this, and basically all they do, and actually this one's a managed switch, all they do is connect multiple devices together. That's it. Real simple. And some of them, like this one, is a PoE, where it gives power, and it's usually a very small amount of power unless it's a very powerful switch, and ones that don't. So ones like this one, I don't think has PoE in it. A very simple gigabit switch, which it's a 4-port switch, but can only support 3 devices because it splits 3 devices. Normally you have an uplink and then your 3 devices. So that's the most basic of switch. Now the switch that I am going to be using today looks like this. This is the exact switch that I'm going to be using to show you guys some basic switch commands. Now, just a little acknowledgement and a little disclaimer. Switch commands differ depending on the switch that you use. And the interface, even the web UI, which I will also show you, it's kind of convoluted because it locks up, breaks all the time. So I prefer command line because at work I use command line, and in most enterprise places, if you're using a switch, you're going to be using a command line interface as opposed to a graphical user interface just for security purposes. But I will show you both. So the first thing is, by default, your switch is not going to be set up to have SSH. You're going to have to turn that on, whether it's through the web UI, which I have up right here, or the command line interface, which you'd have to use a console cable for. A console cable looks like this little device. Cable. And these are what a console cable looks like. They are very simple cables that, if it wants to behave, and actually go to the website like it's supposed to, look like this. One side is a good old-fashioned serial DB9 port, and the other side is an RJ45. And these are specifically created, so don't go out and buy the USB ones because they may or may not work with your switch. The one that comes with your switch is guaranteed to work with your switch. But basically, it's an Ethernet jack on one side and a DB9 on the other. And that's how you're going to have to communicate with it when you first get it. And you'll use a program like PuTTY, and basically your manual will have pretty detailed instructions on how to use that. But the command structure won't be in there. It's very silly, but that's true. So, simple commands are things like show, and I'm going to log into my switch here just so you can see it. SSH 10.0.0.198. Put in my username and my password. And basically the simplest commands you can use are show, which it's going to say incomplete here, but I'm going to say show version. And you can use shorthand as well, like I am using a shorthand here. The fully correct Cisco way of typing it is show version. That is the fully correct way of doing it. but in an actual field environment, you'll start using shorthand real fast because it's going to get really boring and long and time consuming to type in the whole command instead of just shorthanding it, which you could do in, you'd be surprised how little you have to type to do quite a bit, like show interface stat. That's all I needed to type instead of show interface status, which would be like this, show interface status. It will work, it's the same command, but it's much longer. So for my purposes, I like to use shorthand, and that's what I'll be using for the remainder of this. Now, there are 3 levels of, that's where it comes up and says when stuff happens. So if a port violation occurs, it'll come up here. If somebody connects back, it's going to do that. So there are 3 levels. One is the most basic level, which I'm not even going to go into it right now because I don't have it set up. But basically all it does is allow you to use the show commands like the one I just used. You can't make any changes whatsoever. However, you can use, it is the second level, I think it's called the enable menu, or it's basically a power user menu. And what it does is it allows you to do some basic stuff, like clear a port MAC. So I'll say clear, I'm not going to actually do this because I don't want to have to do that again, MAC address, and you can use the little question mark and it'll tell you what you want to do, and you'll say dynamic or secure, in this case secure, and then question mark, interface, and you can also do port, which I believe is for port security. No, it's just interface. Interface, and we'll say gigabit, and 04, there's nothing on 04, so I can do that pretty safely. And that just clears any MAC addresses that are associated with port 4 on the switch. And you can do that in this level. It's very simple stuff that you can do here. And there's a whole list of things you can do. Right here, you can do a ping. You can do a telnet or an SSH connection to something else, which is actually stupid cool that you can do an SSH session from within a switch, because it actually means that if you're in the wrong switch, you can SSH into the right switch if you know the code to do it and you have the credentials. You will not be able to do that if your switch is using some level of 2-factor for your password. You would need to have 1-factor for that to work from within the switch. Renew the IP address of the device, which preferably should be static for switches, because if you make it so it's DHCP and it's not reserved, your management team could go crazy because the IP of your switch is about to change. It's crazy. Copy, very simple stuff that you can do here. There's a 3rd level, which is, I call it like super user, but I forget what, I think they call it like executive level or something. And that is when you go into configuration mode. It's like super user mode. You can do almost anything you want on the switch here. And this is where I can start screwing around with the switch. The most basic thing you can do in here is rename the switch. So I'll do that now. Host name, test switch. And now the host name in the corner here says test switch. So that's what this is. And I can go in, I can configure a VLAN, I can say interface VLAN 2 and do whatever I want in here. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do in here. You can set ACLs, you can shut down that VLAN, which will stop anything going on in that VLAN from happening. This is the local control from the switch level control of a network. You always hear that, you know, some countries have a kill switch for their internet. Believe it or not, this might be how they do it. You go right into wherever the port is, and they just say, so instead of this, I'll say exit, and I could say if port 01 is going to Comcast or whatever, they would say conf t, and then to get to here, and then they'd say interface GI1 shut, and it shuts down that port. Anything connected to it is shut down. That's all it takes to shut something down on a switch. I don't know if that is how they do it, but it would be a very effective way of doing it, because it just cuts anything past that switch or router straight out. That's all it takes to shut down, to shut something down. Now, the question you might be wondering is, I said VLAN. What is a VLAN? VLAN is a virtual network within your network. And I can say right here, so VLAN 1 is the primary network of a switch. That is when you plug a switch in, that's what gets created. VLAN 2, if you have a managed switch, you can create a VLAN and you can name it whatever you want. It can be 2, it can be 20, it can be 20,000 for all they care. I think it stops at 300 and something thousand or something. It's some ridiculous number that you'll never actually hit. And I have it set for off-net, so for things like little tiny experiments and stuff that I do on that VLAN. And that VLAN, so if I say show VLAN 2, interface status, show running interface VLAN 2, it'll tell me everything I need to know about it. What's the configuration of VLAN 2? In this case, it's just the name and its IP address. It does have an IP address. In this case, it is the IP address for it on there is 192.168.0.254 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. This level is the level that most technicians would touch. So if you are a specialist of some kind, if you're an IT specialist or IT analyst that's doing things like port security, VLAN management, things like that, this is the stuff you would be dealing with. You wouldn't be dealing with all of the actual creation of the VLANs and things like that. I did create that VLAN, and it does work, but that's the most basic form of a VLAN to be set up. So one of the most powerful commands you can do on a switch, well, not powerful, but most important, is question mark on any Cisco switch. Why? It tells you what you're doing. It tells you what you can do, what you can't do, basically things like that. You can even do show flash, I believe it is, if it wants to flash, and I forget how to do this. There's a way to see what's on the actual device, and that can kind of, I believe it's DIR actually. DIR, yep, there you go. directory. And it'll tell you what's going on here, and you can change the directory to system, and I can go to dir, and it'll tell me everything that's in there, what applications are in there, just like on a regular computer. This actually runs off of a BSD based system, so that's why you see, that's why it says dr-x, all that stuff, because these are actually, this is a BSD system that Cisco just uses. So that's the command line in a nutshell. It's very basic understanding of it. The most important thing to know is really that question mark is, hey, what can I do at each level? What each level can do. So the most basic level is show, the second level is small execution, and the third level is super user. Again, based on your administration, wherever you are, whatever place you're working for, that could be different. So now I'm going to log into the web UI, which looks way different and looks like we're in the 21st century as opposed to in the 20th century. So this is the web UI. It looks very similar to what you would find on a router. In fact, it's basically a router configuration. And you can go in, you can see under dashboard, you've got the most important stuff. What the heck just happened? Things like temperature, your CPU utilization. If I go down to your status, it'll tell me what the port interface utilization is. If I click on a port, it'll tell me, it'll take me to where I can modify a port. Here's the utilization that says, hey, how much am I using on each one? Right now I'm using almost nothing on all of them. I can change that very quickly by just doing something like this. YouTube, and click on video. Go back on the switch. And it should refresh and say I'm using some switch.
He's gonna take you back to the past.
And of course it's making a liar out of me. Probably because I'm using so little of the port currently. And you got different interface options to say, hey, what's going on? Down here is where a lot of the administrative settings are going to be set. Your login banner, which is basically going to say stuff like, we'll prosecute you if you do something stupid in here. This is, please don't do something stupid in here. Things like that. Location, contact information, user accounts. If you want to set up a new account for multiple users, each technician would probably have their own account to the switch. Timeouts for different things. In this case, you got HTTP is 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and you can change this to never, 1 minute, or whatever you want. Well, actually, it's really 1, 5, 10, 30, or never. And usually for SSH, it's 10 minutes. HTTP is usually 1 or 5 minutes if it's on at all. And console is usually never. I don't know why it says 10 minutes, but it's usually never for console, because you need physical access to the switch to get to a console. Then you got port management here. This is similar to that show interface status I ran in the command. And I can click on a port, and I can click edit, and I can look at that port. These are the basic settings you can change in here. This is one reason I don't like the web UI all that much, is there's a different place for everything. In the commands, you literally, everything is done in the same place. You just need to know what to type. So this is what is your auto advertisement of what it can do, and negotiation, how fast do you want it to go, what speed specifically do you want it to be, full, half, all that junk. By default, you generally want it to be maximum. You got error recovery status. Now this is where you can find a port security violation, and you can go in and you can clear it here. This is the simplest way to clear a port security violation, but the reason why a lot of people don't use, a lot of institutions do not use WebUI is it is inherently less secure than the command line system, because the command line system, first of all, can do two-factor authentication while the direct WebUI can't. That's a big plus to why they would use the command line as opposed to the WebUI, and also because generally, if you are on the base VLAN, if you're on VLAN 1, and somebody goes typing in stuff, they might accidentally find your WebUI. And that's one extra security hole. So often in enterprise environments or small business environments, if they're using a managed switch, they've turned that off, which you do down in security, TCP, UDP services, and you uncheck this box. So I turned my SSH on. By default, these two are on. I turned both of these off. I turned HTTP on for the purposes of this video to show you how it works. This is the port security tab. This, I can go in, I can set port security limits, what I want to do with it. The only one that currently has it is GI10, which has it on lock with a maximum of 2, and it is set to what they call a classic lock, which basically means you can't make any changes to this until you turn port security off. The action on violation is to just throw it away. Throw it away. Don't let it connect, just bye-bye. And you can set it to forward it to something else if you want to do some sort of logging system. Or you can just flat out tell it to shut down, which is the safest and most used option. Just shut down the port. We don't want to deal with it. And then you got ACLs, which you can do a whole bunch of junk in here that is basically an ACL is more or less a firewall, and you can tell it to do blah blah blah, apply, and it will do stuff. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to remove it. But you can tell it to do all kinds of different stuff. Priorities, the IP addresses you want to send it to, source port, destination port, flags. This is basically how every secure network is created, is through ACLs. The average ACL length of a frickin' switch is like 30,000 ACLs, because basically an ACL, if it's a good ACL, is like a really, really strong firewall that says, don't do any of this except if I said it here. So things like printers, they operate on port 9100, and there would be an ACL that says allow that to happen, to go to the print server or to the computer. And then you got VLANs for ACLs, things like that. You also have quality of service, which allows you to say, edit, and I can say what I want to do. What priority is this port? How important is what's on this thing? So, like say you were working in a hospital and port number 7 went to a computer next to a patient, and port number 4 went to some doctor's office. Port number 4 would have a lower priority than port number 7. That's a very simplified idea of QoS. A lot of people today they know that as you got somebody in your house who's gaming and you're using up all your resources and you kind of turn down their priority. And they don't really realize it until it's too late. Because a lot of people don't really think about how the back end of a network works. You also have smart port here. This feature, and this is also in the command line, it's another option in the configuration T menu. And basically what this does is it allows you to make it, and by default this happens, what it allows you to do is if you have a Cisco device that uses a voice VLAN, it will automatically detect that and create, or in this case, throw it to what it's created as the voice VLAN. In this case, that's VLAN 1, and it'll pool those together so that the voice VLAN system works. By default, this is set up that way, but I don't have a server or any of that stuff for it. Any of the configurations, I don't have any of that stuff hooked up, nor do I have a VoIP phone from Cisco to do that with. In here is, so this is, like I showed you before, the entire port settings, all the different stuff. You can copy settings, I can say copy those settings, and I want to send it to GE6, apply, and now GE6 is a copy of GE5. And that is stupid helpful if you have a web UI and you have like a 48 port or a 36 port or whatever switch, and you've got lots of stuff on the same VLAN. So that means I could also do this. I could say copy 10 and make it GE5. And now GE5, in a second, if I go into that, it's going to look exactly like 10 internally. All this stuff's going to be the same. And in theory, actually, if you go over to the port security, it should have also copied those settings over as well. Which GE5 edit, it may not have. It did not. So in theory, it's supposed to do that, and you can do that here as well. Copy these settings to GE5, and now GE5 now has those same rules as GE10 or GI10. So in here, for some reason, it says GE. In the command line, it's GI. I don't really know why they do that, but that is why it is, because GI is supposed to be gigabit and GE is gigabit Ethernet, so I don't really understand that. And then over here, this is where your IPs are set, so instead of typing it out, it's all pooled in this IP configuration, so I can actually set another VLAN if I really so chose to, and I could set a static address for it. This says DHCP. It obtained it via DHCP, but on my DHCP server, actually it's my router for my internet service provider, I have reserved this IP address permanently so that this stays on the switch, so I never have to worry about that again. There's also radius here. This is for wireless. If you have a domain, it allows things to work on certificates for wireless and for other stuff that's above our heads, really. It's really for an enterprise infrastructure, and basically, so if you had a wireless access point, how does it connect, how does it authenticate to say, hey, are you allowed to be here? So in a lot of places, they don't have passwords. What they have is it's an automatic connect to that server. And what it does is it says, hey, I have the certificate on my system, can you validate? And it works. You really only see that in the enterprise environment, not so much in small business or in a home environment, just because it takes a lot of hardware to set that up, such as a radius server, as it talks about here. This is the client side, there's a server side as well. So on mine I have disabled because it simply doesn't work. This also here, TCP UDP services, is where you will turn on and power to your switch. So you can turn everything off if you really felt like it, and then the only way you could get back into that switch is through the console cable. And a console cable, again, looks like this. And that is the most secure way to secure a switch, because guess what? You need physical access to make any changes to that switch. But most places don't configure it that way because it's a royal pain in the arse. And then you got some very simple stuff that's located in things like your configuration wizard. If you want to create a VLAN, you can do a simple click, click, click to create a VLAN. So I'll click on port 4. Next, we're going to call it new VLAN. VLAN ID will be 3. VLAN name will be new VLAN. And this is the simplest way to create a VLAN. Next. 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 Done. And you have a VLAN there. And I can go down and I can look at the VLAN management, VLAN settings, and I will see a new VLAN here. I can delete it. And that's it. Now, I also now need to go back in. That's an orphaned port now. So I technically have to go back in and say VLAN settings, interface settings, number 4, because it says it's a trunk. It is not. Edit. Access. Go. Now it is back on VLAN 1. That's what happens if you delete it. If you delete a VLAN without taking stuff off of it, it's called orphaning, and it basically means the VLAN that was there does not exist anymore, so it automatically trunks that port. That's just how it works. And in an enterprise environment, that could be a real pain in the butt, because you don't know what's there to be there correctly and what's not sometimes. I know it doesn't sound like that should be the case, but it most certainly is. So that is switches in a nutshell when it comes from whether it's the command line or the web UI. It's basically what a switch would look like in a small business environment. In an enterprise environment, the command line structure looks very similar, but is different. So I work on enterprise switches at work every day, and they use slightly different command structures. Those structures vary because the port security is different on the enterprise switches, because they use what's called sticky, where it sticks that MAC to the port permanently until you take it off. And there's a bunch of other weird quality of service and domain settings on enterprise switches, and domain settings are the big, they're the one that really kicks it in the butt. So basically this is switching in a nutshell.